Chapter 2. Being in the world in general as the basic state of Dasein. Section 12. A preliminary sketch of being in the world in terms of an orientation towards being in as such. In our preparatory discussions, we have brought out some characteristics of being which will provide us with a steady light for our further investigation, but which will at the same time become structurally concrete as that investigation continues. Dasein is an entity which, in its very being, comports itself understandingly towards that being. In saying this, we are calling attention to the formal concept of existence. Dasein exists. Furthermore, Dasein is an entity which in each case I, myself, am. Mindness belongs to any existent Dasein, and belongs to it as the condition which makes authenticity and inauthenticity possible. In each case, Dasein exists in one or the other of these two modes, or else it is modally undifferentiated. But these are both ways in which Dasein's being takes on a definite character, and they must be seen and understood a priori as grounded upon that state of being which we have called being in the world. An interpretation of this constitutive state is needed if we are to set up our analytic of Dasein correctly. The compound expression being in the world indicates in the very way we have coined it that it stands for a unitary phenomenon. This primary datum must be seen as a whole. But while being in the world cannot be broken up into contents which may be pieced together, this does not prevent it from having several constitutive items in its structure. Indeed, the phenomenal datum, which our expression indicates as one which may, in fact, be looked at in three ways. If we study it, keeping the whole phenomenon firmly in mind beforehand, the following items may be brought out for emphasis. First, the in the world. With regard to this, there arises the task of inquiring into the ontological structure of the world, and defining the idea of worldhood as such. Second, that entity which in every case has being in the world as the way in which it is. Here we are seeking that which one inquires into when one asks the question, who? By a phenomenological demonstration we shall determine who is in the mode of Dasein's average everydayness. Third, being in sein, as such. We must set forth the ontological constitution of inhood, Inheit itself. Emphasis upon any one of these constitutive items signifies that the others are emphasized along with it. This means that in any such case the whole phenomenon gets seen. Of course, being in the world is a state of Dasein which is necessary a priori, but it is far from sufficient for completely determining Dasein's being. Before making these three phenomena the themes for special analyses, we shall attempt, by way of orientation, to characterize the third of these factors. What is meant by being in? Our proximal reaction is to round out this expression to being in the world, and we're inclined to understand this being in as being in something, sein in. This latter term designates the kind of being which an entity has when it is in another one, as the water is in the glass, or the garment is in the cupboard. By this in we mean the relationship of being which two entities extended in space have to each other with regard to their location in that space. Both water and glass, garment and cupboard, are in space and at a location, and both in the same way. This relationship of being can be expanded. For instance, the bench is in the lecture room is in the university is in the city, and so on, until we can say that the bench is in world space. All entities whose being in one another can thus be described have the same kind of being, that of being present at hand, as things occurring within the world. Being present at hand in something which is likewise present at hand, and being present at hand along with, mit vorhanden sein, in the sense of a definite location relationship with something else, which has the same kind of being, are ontological characteristics which we call categorial. They are of such a sort as to belong to entities whose kind of being is not of the character of Dasein. Being in, on the other hand, is a state of Dasein's being. It is an existentiale. So one cannot think of it as the being present at hand of some corporeal thing, such as a human body, in an entity which is present at hand. Nor does the term being in mean a spatial in one another-ness of things present at hand, any more than the word in primordially signifies a spatial relationship of this kind. In is derived from innan, to reside, habitare, to dwell, sich aufhalten. An signifies I am accustomed, I am familiar with, I look after something. It has the signification of kolo, I till the ground, in the senses of habito, I dwell, and diligio, I choose. The entity to which being in this signification belongs is one which we have characterized as that entity which in each case I myself am, bin. The expression bin is connected with bei, and so ich bin, I am, means in its turn I reside or dwell alongside the world, as that which is familiar to me in such and such a way. Being, sein, as the infinitive of ich bin, that is to say when it is understood as an existentiale, signifies to reside alongside, to be familiar with. Being in is thus the formal existential expression for the being of Dasein, which has being in the world as its essential state. Being alongside the world in the sense of being absorbed in the world, a sense which calls for still closer interpretation, is an existentiale, something existential, founded upon being in. In these analyses, the issue is one of seeing a primordial structure of Dasein's being, a structure in accordance with whose phenomenal content the concepts of being must be articulated. Because of this, and because this structure is in principle one which cannot be grasped by the traditional ontological categories, this being alongside must be examined still more closely. We shall again choose the method of contrasting it with a relationship of being which is essentially different ontologically, namely categorial, but which we express by the same linguistic means. Fundamental ontological distinctions are easily obliterated, and if they are to be envisaged phenomenally in this way, this must be done explicitly, even at the risk of discussing the obvious. The status of the ontological analytic shows, however, that we have been far from interpreting these obvious matters with an adequate grasp, still less with regard for the meaning of their being, and we are even farther from possessing a stable coinage for the appropriate structural concepts. As an existentiale, something existential, being alongside the world, never means anything like the being present at hand together of things that occur. There is no such thing as the side-by-sideness of an entity called Dasein with another entity called world. Of course, when the two things are present at hand together alongside one another, we are accustomed to express this occasionally by something like the table stands by the door, or the chair touches, berührt, the wall. Taken strictly, touching is never what we are talking about in such cases, not because accurate re-examination will always eventually establish that there is a space between the chair and the wall, but because in principle the chair can never touch the wall, even if the space between them should be equal to 0. If the chair could touch the wall, this would presuppose that the wall is the sort of thing for which a chair would be encounterable. An entity present at hand within the world can be touched by another entity only if by its very nature the latter entity has being in as its own kind of being. Only if, with its being there, Dasein, something like the world is already revealed to it, so that from out of that world another entity can manifest itself in touching, and thus become accessible in its being present at hand. When two entities are present at hand within the world, and furthermore are worldless in themselves, they can never touch each other, nor can either of them be alongside the other. The clause "furthermore" are worldless must not be left out, for even entities which are not worldless, Dasein itself, for example, are present at hand in the world, or more exactly can, with some right and within certain limits, be taken as merely present at hand. To do this, one must completely disregard or just not see the existential state of being in. But the fact that Dasein can be taken as something which is present at hand and just present at hand is not to be confused with a certain way of presence at hand which is Dasein's own. This latter kind of presence at hand becomes accessible not by disregarding Dasein's specific structures, but only by understanding them in advance. Dasein understands its ownmost being in the sense of a certain factual being present at hand. And yet the factuality of the fact, Tatsache of one's own Dasein, is, at bottom, quite different ontologically from the factual occurrence of some kind of mineral, for example. Whenever Dasein is, it is as a fact, and the factuality of such a fact is what we shall call Dasein's facticity. This is a definite way of being, Seinsbestimmtheit, and it has a complicated structure which cannot even be grasped as a problem until Dasein's basic existential states have been worked out. The concept of facticity implies that an entity within the world has being in the world in such a way that it can understand itself as bound up in its destiny with the being of those entities which it encounters within its own world. In the first instance, it is enough to see the ontological difference between being in as an existentiale and the category of the insideness which things present at hand can have with regard to one another. By thus delimiting being in, we are not denying every kind of spatiality to Dasein. On the contrary, Dasein itself has a being in space of its own, but this in turn is possible only on the basis of being in the world in general. Hence being in is not to be explained ontologically by some ontical characterization, as if one were to say, for instance, that being in a world is a spiritual property, and that man's spatiality is a result of his bodily nature, which at the same time always gets founded upon corporeality. Here again we are faced with the being present at hand together of some such spiritual thing along with a corporeal thing, while the being of the entity, thus compounded, remains more obscure than ever. Not until we understand being in the world as an essential structure of Dasein can we have any insight into Dasein's existential spatiality. Such an insight will keep us from failing to see this structure or from previously cancelling it out, a procedure motivated not ontologically but rather metaphysically by the naive supposition that man is, in the first instance, a spiritual thing which subsequently gets misplaced into a space. Dasein's facticity is such that its being in the world has always dispersed, zerstreut itself, or even split itself up into definite ways of being in. The multiplicity of these is indicated by the following examples: having to do with something, producing something, attending to something and looking after it, making use of something, giving something up and letting it go, undertaking, accomplishing, evincing, interrogating, considering, discussing, determining. All these ways of being in have concern as their kind of being, a kind of being which we have yet to characterize in detail. Leaving undone, neglecting, renouncing, taking a rest, these too are ways of concern. But these are all deficient modes in which the possibilities of concern are kept to a bare minimum. The term concern has, in the first instance, its colloquial, vorwissenschaftliche signification, and can mean to carry out something, to get it done, erledigen, to straighten it out. It can also mean to provide oneself with something. We use the expression with still another characteristic turn of phrase when we say, "I'm concerned for the success of the undertaking." Here, concern means something like apprehensiveness. In contrast to these colloquial ontical significations, the expression concern will be used in this investigation as an ontological term for an existentiale, and will designate the being of a possible way of being in the world. This term has been chosen not because Dasein happens to be proximally and to a large extent practical and economic, but because the being of Dasein itself is to be made visible as care. This expression too is to be taken as an ontological, structural concept. It has nothing to do with tribulation, melancholy, or the cares of life, though ontically one can come across these in every Dasein. These, like their opposites, gaiety and freedom from care, are ontically possible only because Dasein, when understood ontologically, is care. Because being in the world belongs essentially to Dasein. Its being towards the world, Sein zur Welt, is essentially concern. From what we have been saying, it follows that being in is not a property, which Dasein sometimes has and sometimes does not have, and without which it could be just as well as it could without it. It is not the case that man is and then has, by way of an extra, a relationship of being towards the world, a world with which he provides himself occasionally. Dasein is never proximally an entity which is, so to speak, free from being in, but which sometimes has the inclination to take up a relationship towards the world. Taking up relationships towards the world is possible only because Dasein, as being in the world, is as it is. This state of being does not arise just because some other entity is present at hand outside of Dasein and meets up with it. Such an entity can meet up with Dasein only insofar as it can, of its own accord, show itself within a world. Nowadays there is much talk about man's having an environment, Umwelt. But this says nothing ontologically as long as this having is left indefinite. In its very possibility, this having is founded upon the existential state of being in. Because Dasein is essentially an entity with being in, it can explicitly discover those entities which it encounters environmentally. It can know them. It can avail itself of them. It can have the world. To talk about having an environment is ontically trivial, but ontologically it presents a problem. To solve it requires nothing else than defining the being of Dasein, and doing so in a way which is ontologically adequate. Although this state of being is one of which use has been made in biology, especially since K. von Baer, one must not conclude that its philosophical use implies biologism. For the environment is a structure which even biology, as a positive science, can never find and can never define, but must presuppose and constantly employ. Yet even as an a priori condition for the objects which biology takes for its theme, this structure itself can be explained philosophically only if it has been conceived beforehand as a structure of Dasein. Only in terms of an orientation towards the ontological structure thus conceived can life as a state of being be defined a priori, and this must be done in a privative manner. Ontically as well as ontologically, the priority belongs to being in the world as concern. In the analytic of Dasein, this structure undergoes a basic interpretation. But have we not confined ourselves to negative assertions in all our attempts to determine the nature of this state of being? Though this being in is supposedly so fundamental, we always keep hearing about what it is not. Yes, indeed. But there is nothing accidental about our characterizing it predominantly in so negative a manner. In doing so, we have rather made known what is peculiar to this phenomenon, and our characterization is therefore positive in a genuine sense, a sense appropriate to the phenomenon itself. When being in the world is exhibited phenomenologically, disguises and concealments are rejected because this phenomenon itself always gets seen in a certain way in every Dasein. And it thus gets seen because it makes up a basic state of Dasein, and in every case is already disclosed for Dasein's understanding of being, and disclosed along with that being itself. But for the most part this phenomenon has been explained in a way which is basically wrong, or interpreted in an ontologically inadequate manner. On the other hand, this seeing in a certain way, and yet for the most part wrongly explaining, is itself based upon nothing else than this very state of Dasein's being, which is such that Dasein itself, and this means also its being in the world, gets its ontological understanding of itself in the first instance from those entities which it itself is not, but which it encounters within its world, and from the being which they possess. Both in Dasein and for it, this state of being is always in some way familiar, bekannt. Now, if it is also to become known, erkannt, the knowing which such a task explicitly implies takes itself, as a knowing of the world, Welterkennen, as the chief exemplification of the soul's relationship to the world. Knowing the world, noein, or rather addressing oneself to the world and discussing it, logos, thus functions as the primary mode of being in the world, even though being in the world does not as such get conceived. But because this structure of being remains ontologically inaccessible, yet is experienced ontically as a relationship between one entity, the world, and another, the soul, and because one proximally understands being by taking entities as entities within the world, for one's ontological foothold, one tries to conceive the relationship between world and soul as grounded in these two entities themselves, and in the meaning of their being, namely to conceive it as being present at hand. And even though being in the world is something of which one has pre-phenomenological experience, and acquaintance, erfahren und gekannt, it becomes invisible if one interprets it in a way which is ontologically inappropriate. This state of Dasein's being is now one with which one is just barely acquainted, and indeed as something obvious, with the stamp of an inappropriate interpretation. So in this way it becomes the evident point of departure for problems of epistemology, or the metaphysics of knowledge. For what is more obvious than that a subject is related to an object and vice versa? This subject-object relationship must be presupposed. But while this presupposition is unimpeachable in its facticity, this makes it indeed a baleful one if its ontological necessity, and especially its ontological meaning, are to be left in the dark. Thus, the phenomenon of being in has, for the most part, been represented exclusively by a single exemplar, knowing the world. This has not only been the case in epistemology, for even practical behavior has been understood as behavior which is non-theoretical and a-theoretical. Because knowing has been given this priority, our understanding of its ownmost kind of being gets led astray, and accordingly being in the world must be exhibited even more precisely with regard to knowing the world, and must itself be made visible as an existential modality of being in. Section 13. A founded mode in which being in is exemplified. Knowing the world. If being in the world is a basic state of Dasein, and one in which Dasein operates not only in general, but preeminently in the mode of everydayness, then it must also be something which has always been experienced ontically. It would be unintelligible for being in the world to remain totally veiled from view, especially since Dasein has at its disposal an understanding of its own being, no matter how indefinitely this understanding may function. But no sooner was the phenomenon of knowing the world grasped than it got interpreted in a superficial, formal manner. The evidence for this is the procedure, still customary today, of setting up knowing as a relation between subject and object, a procedure in which there lurks as much truth as vacuity. But subject and object do not coincide with Dasein and the world. Even if it were feasible to give an ontological definition of being in, primarily in terms of a being in the world which knows, it would still be our first task to show that knowing has the phenomenal character of a being which is in and towards the world. If one reflects upon this relationship of being, an entity called nature is given proximally as that which becomes known. Knowing as such is not to be met in this entity. If knowing is, at all, it belongs solely to those entities which know. But even in those entities, human things, knowing is not present at hand. In any case, it is not externally ascertainable as, let us say, bodily properties are. Now, inasmuch as knowing belongs to these entities and is not some external characteristic, it must be inside. Now, the more unequivocally one maintains that knowing is proximally and really inside, and indeed has by no means the same kind of being as entities which are both physical and psychical, the less one presupposes when one believes that one is making headway in the question of the essence of knowledge and in the clarification of the relationship between subject and object. For only then can the problem arise of how this knowing subject comes out of its inner sphere into one which is other and external, of how knowing can have any object at all, and of how one must think of the object itself so that, eventually, the subject knows it without needing to venture a leap into another sphere. But in any of the numerous varieties which this approach may take, the question of the kind of being which belongs to this knowing subject is left entirely unasked, though whenever its knowing gets handled, its way of being is already included tacitly in one's theme. Of course, we are sometimes assured that we are certainly not to think of the subject's inside, innen, and its inner sphere, as a sort of box or cabinet. But when one asks for the positive signification of this inside of immanence, in which knowing is proximally enclosed, or when one inquires how this being inside, Innenseins, which knowing possesses, has its own character of being grounded in the kind of being which belongs to the subject, then silence reigns. And no matter how this inner sphere may get interpreted, if one does no more than ask how knowing makes its way out of it and achieves transcendence, it becomes evident that the knowing which presents such enigmas will remain problematical unless one has previously clarified how it is and what it is. With this kind of approach one remains blind to what is already tacitly implied, even when one takes the phenomenon of knowing as one's theme in the most provisional manner, namely that knowing is a mode of being of Dasein, as being in the world, and is founded ontically upon this state of being. But if, as we suggest, we thus find phenomenally that knowing is a kind of being which belongs to being in the world, one might object that with such an interpretation of knowing the problem of knowledge is nullified, for what is left to be asked if one presupposes that knowing is already alongside its world, when it is not supposed to reach that world except in the transcending of the subject? In this question, the constructivist standpoint, which has not been phenomenally demonstrated, again comes to the fore. But quite apart from this, what higher court is to decide whether, and in what sense, there is to be any problem of knowledge other than that of the phenomenon of knowing as such, and the kind of being which belongs to the knower. If we now ask what shows itself in the phenomenal findings about knowing, we must keep in mind that knowing is grounded beforehand in a being already alongside the world, which is essentially constitutive for Dasein's being. Proximally, this being already alongside is not just a fixed staring at something that is purely present at hand. Being in the world, as concern, is fascinated by the world with which it is concerned. If knowing is to be possible as a way of determining the nature of the present at hand by observing it, then there must first be a deficiency in our having to do with the world concernfully. When concern holds back, sich enthalten, from any kind of producing, manipulating, and the like, it puts itself into what is now the sole remaining mode of being in, the mode of just tarrying alongside, das nur noch verweilen bei. This kind of being towards the world is one which lets us encounter entities within the world purely in the way they look, eidos, shape or form, just that. On the basis of this kind of being, and as a mode of it, looking explicitly at what we encounter is possible. Looking at something in this way is sometimes a definite way of taking up a direction towards something, of setting our sights towards what is present at hand. It takes over a viewpoint in advance from the entity which it encounters. Such looking at enters the mode of dwelling autonomously alongside entities within the world. In this kind of dwelling, as a holding oneself back from any manipulation or utilization, the perception of the present at hand is consummated. Perception is consummated when one addresses oneself to something as something and discusses it as such. This amounts to interpretation in the broadest sense, and on the basis of such interpretation, perception becomes an act of making determinate. What is thus perceived and made determinate can be expressed in propositions, and can be retained and preserved as what has thus been asserted. This perceptive retention of an assertion about something is itself a way of being in the world. It is not to be interpreted as a procedure by which a subject provides itself with representations, Vorstellungen, of something which remain stored up, inside, as having been thus appropriated, and with regard to which the question of how they agree with actuality can occasionally arise. When Dasein directs itself towards something and grasps it, it does not somehow first get out of an inner sphere in which it has been proximally encapsulated, but its primary kind of being is such that it is always outside, alongside entities which it encounters and which belong to a world already discovered. Nor is any inner sphere abandoned when Dasein dwells alongside the entity to be known, and determines its character. But even in this being outside, alongside the object, Dasein is still inside if we understand this in the correct sense. That is to say, it is itself inside, as a being in the world which knows. And furthermore, the perceiving of what is known is not a process of returning with one's booty to the cabinet of consciousness after one has gone out and grasped it. Even in perceiving, retaining and preserving, the Dasein which knows remains outside, and it does so as Dasein. If I merely know, wissen, about some way in which the being of entities is interconnected, if I only represent them, if I do no more than think about them, I am no less alongside the entities outside in the world than when I originally grasped them. Even the forgetting of something in which every relationship of being towards what one formerly knew has seemingly been obliterated must be conceived as a modification of the primordial being in, and this holds for every delusion and for every error. We have now pointed out how those modes of being in the world, which are constitutive for knowing the world, are interconnected in their foundations. This makes it plain that in knowing, Dasein achieves a new status of being, Seinsstand, towards a world which has already been discovered in Dasein itself. This new possibility of being can develop itself autonomously. It can become a task to be accomplished, and as scientific knowledge it can take over the guidance for being in the world. But a commercium of the subject with the world does not get created for the first time by knowing. Nor does it arise from some way in which the world acts upon a subject. Knowing is a mode of Dasein founded upon being in the world. Thus, being in the world, as a basic state, must be interpreted beforehand. Beforehand. Chapter 3. the worldhood of the world. Section 14. The idea of the worldhood of the world in general. Being in the world shall first be made visible with regard to that item of its structure which is the world itself. To accomplish this task seems easy and so trivial as to make one keep taking for granted that it may be dispensed with. What can be meant by describing the world as a phenomenon? It means to let us see what shows itself in entities within the world. Here the first step is to enumerate the things that are in the world. Houses, trees, people, mountains, stars. We can depict the way such entities look, and we can give an account of occurrences in them and with them. This, however, is obviously a pre-phenomenological business, which cannot be at all relevant phenomenologically. Such a description is always confined to entities. It is ontical. But what we are seeking is being, and we have formally defined phenomenon in the phenomenological sense as that which shows itself as being, and as a structure of being. Thus, to give a phenomenological description of the world will mean to exhibit the being of those entities which are present at hand within the world, and to fix it in concepts which are categorial. Now, the entities within the world are things, things of nature, and things invested with value, wertbehaftete Dinge. Their thinghood becomes a problem, and to the extent that the thinghood of things, invested with value, is based upon the thinghood of nature, our primary theme is the being of things of nature, nature as such. That characteristic of being which belongs to things of nature, substances, and upon which everything is founded, is substantiality. What is its ontological meaning? By asking this, we have given an unequivocal direction to our inquiry. But is this a way of asking ontologically about the world? The problematic which we have thus marked out is one which is undoubtedly ontological. But even if this ontology should itself succeed in explicating the being of nature in the very purest manner, in conformity with the basic assertions about this entity, which the mathematical natural sciences provide, it will never reach the phenomenon that is the world. Nature is itself an entity which is encountered within the world, and which can be discovered in various ways and at various stages. Should we then first attach ourselves to those entities with which Dasein proximally and for the most part dwells, things invested with value? Do not these really show us the world in which we live? Perhaps, in fact, they show us something like the world more penetratingly. But these things, too, are entities within the world. Neither the ontical depiction of entities within the world, nor the ontological interpretation of their being, is such as to reach the phenomenon of the world. In both of these ways of access to objective being, the world has already been presupposed, and indeed in various ways. Is it possible that ultimately we cannot address ourselves to the world as determining the nature of the entity we have mentioned? Yet we call this entity one which is within the world. Is world perhaps a characteristic of Dasein's being? And in that case, does every Dasein proximally have its world? Does not world thus become something subjective? How then can there be a common world, in which, nevertheless, we are? And if we raise the question of the world, what world do we have in view? Neither the common world, nor the subjective world, but the worldhood of the world as such. By what avenue do we meet this phenomenon? Worldhood is an ontological concept, and stands for the structure of one of the constitutive items of being in the world. But we know being in the world as a way in which Dasein's character is defined existentially. Thus worldhood itself is an existentiale. If we inquire ontologically about the world, we by no means abandon the analytic of Dasein as a field for thematic study. Ontologically, world is not a way of characterizing those entities which Dasein essentially is not. It is rather a characteristic of Dasein itself. This does not rule out the possibility that when we investigate the phenomenon of the world, we must do so by the avenue of entities within the world and the being which they possess. The task of describing the world phenomenologically is so far from obvious that, even if we do no more than determine adequately what form it shall take, essential ontological clarifications will be needed. This discussion of the word world and our frequent use of it have made it apparent that it is used in several ways. By unravelling these, we can get an indication of the different kinds of phenomena that are signified, and of the way in which they are interconnected. 1. World is used as an ontical concept, and signifies the totality of those entities which can be present at hand within the world. 2. World functions as an ontological term, and signifies the being of those entities which we have just mentioned. And indeed world can become a term for any realm which encompasses a multiplicity of entities. For instance, when one talks of the world of a mathematician, world signifies the realm of possible objects of mathematics. 3. World can be understood in another ontical sense, not, however, as those entities which Dasein essentially is not, and which can be encountered within the world, but rather as that wherein a factical Dasein as such can be said to live. World has here a pre-ontological existentiel signification. Here again there are different possibilities. World may stand for the public, we world, or one's own closest domestic environment. 4. Finally, world designates the ontologico-existential concept of worldhood. Worldhood itself may have as its modes whatever structural wholes any special worlds may have at the time, but it embraces in itself the a priori character of worldhood in general. We shall reserve the expression world as a term for our third signification. If we should sometimes use it in the first of these senses, we shall mark this with single quotation marks. The derivative form, worldly, will then apply terminologically to a kind of being which belongs to Dasein, never to a kind which belongs to entities present at hand in the world. We shall designate these latter entities as belonging to the world, or within the world, weltzugehörig oder innerweltlich. A glance at previous ontology shows that if one fails to see being in the world as a state of Dasein, the phenomenon of worldhood likewise gets passed over. One tries instead to interpret the world in terms of the being of those entities which are present at hand within the world, but which are by no means proximately discovered, namely in terms of nature. If one understands nature ontologico-categorically, one finds that nature is a limiting case of the being of possible entities within the world. Only in some definite mode of its own being in the world can Dasein discover entities as nature. This manner of knowing them has the character of depriving the world of its worldhood in a definite way. Nature, as the categorial aggregate of those structures of being which a definite entity encountered within the world may possess, can never make worldhood intelligible. But even the phenomenon of nature, as it is conceived, for instance, in Romanticism, can be grasped ontologically only in terms of the concept of the world, that is to say, in terms of the analytic of Dasein. When it comes to the problem of analyzing the world's worldhood ontologically, traditional ontology operates in a blind alley, if indeed it sees this problem at all. On the other hand, if we are to interpret the worldhood of Dasein, and the possible ways in which Dasein is made worldly, Verweltlichung, we must show why the kind of being with which Dasein knows the world is such that it passes over the phenomenon of worldhood, both ontically and ontologically. But at the same time, the very fact of this passing over suggests that we must take special precautions to get the right phenomenal point of departure, Ausgang, for access, Zugang, to the phenomenon of worldhood, so that it will not get passed over. Our method has already been assigned, Anweisung. The theme of our analytic is to be being in the world, and accordingly the very world itself, and these are to be considered within the horizon of average everydayness, the kind of being which is closest to Dasein. We must make a study of everyday being in the world. With the phenomenal support which this gives us, something like the world must come into view. That world of everyday Dasein which is closest to it is the environment. From this existential character of average being in the world, our investigation will take its course, Gang, towards the idea of worldhood in general. We shall seek the worldhood of the environment, environmentality, by going through an ontological interpretation of those entities within the environment which we encounter as closest to us. The expression environment, Umwelt, contains in the environ, a suggestion of spatiality, yet the around, herum, which is constitutive for the environment, does not have a primarily spatial meaning. Instead, the spatial character, which incontestably belongs to any environment, can be clarified only in terms of the structure of worldhood. From this point of view, Dasein's spatiality, of which we have given an indication in section 12, becomes phenomenally visible. In ontology, however, an attempt has been made to start with spatiality and then to interpret the being of the world as res extensa, an extended thing. In Descartes we find the most extreme tendency towards such an ontology of the world, with indeed a counter-orientation towards the res cogitans, a thinking thing, which does not coincide with Dasein either ontically or ontologically. The analysis of worldhood which we are here attempting can be made clearer if we show how it differs from such an ontological tendency. Our analysis will be completed in 3 stages. A, the analysis of environmentality and worldhood in general. B, an illustrative contrast between our analysis of worldhood and Descartes' ontology of the world. C, the aroundness, das Umhafte, of the environment, and the spatiality of Dasein. A. Analysis of environmentality and worldhood in general. Section 15. The being of the entities encountered in the environment. The being of those entities which we encounter as closest to us can be exhibited phenomenologically if we take as our clue our everyday being in the world, which we also call our dealings in the world and with entities within the world. Such dealings have already dispersed themselves into manifold ways of concern. The kind of dealing which is closest to us is, as we have shown, not a bare perceptual cognition, but rather that kind of concern which manipulates things and puts them to use. And this has its own kind of knowledge. The phenomenological question applies in the first instance to the being of those entities which we encounter in such concern. To assure the kind of seeing which is here required, we must first make a remark about method. In the disclosure and explication of being, entities are in every case our preliminary and our accompanying theme, das Vor- und Mitthematische. But our real theme is being. In the domain of the present analysis, the entities we shall take as our preliminary theme are those which show themselves in our concern with the environment. Such entities are not thereby objects for knowing the world theoretically. They are simply what gets used, what gets produced, and so forth. As entities so encountered, they become the preliminary theme for the purview of a knowing which, as phenomenological, looks primarily towards being, and which, in thus taking being as its theme, takes these entities as its accompanying theme. This phenomenological interpretation is accordingly not a way of knowing those characteristics of entities which themselves are, seiende Beschaffenheiten des Seienden. It is rather a determination of the structure of the being which entities possess. But as an investigation of being, it brings to completion, autonomously and explicitly, that understanding of being which belongs already to Dasein, and which comes alive in any of its dealings with entities. Those entities which serve phenomenologically as our preliminary theme, in this case those which are used or which are to be found in the course of production, become accessible when we put ourselves into the position of concerning ourselves with them in some such way. Taken strictly, this talk about putting ourselves into such a position, sich versetzen, is misleading. For the kind of being which belongs to such concernful dealings is not one into which we need to put ourselves first. This is the way in which everyday Dasein always is. When I open the door, for instance, I use the latch. The achieving of phenomenological access to the entities which we encounter consists rather in thrusting aside our interpretative tendencies, which keep thrusting themselves upon us, and running along with us, and which conceal not only the phenomenon of such concern, but even more those entities themselves as encountered of their own accord in our concern with them. These entangling errors become plain if in the course of our investigation we now ask which entities shall be taken as our preliminary theme and established as the pre-phenomenal basis for our study. One may answer, things. But with this obvious answer we have perhaps already missed the pre-phenomenal basis we are seeking. For in addressing these entities as things, res, we have tacitly anticipated their ontological character. When analysis starts with such entities and goes on to inquire about being, what it meets is thinghood and reality. Ontological explication discovers, as it proceeds, such characteristics of being as substantiality, materiality, extendedness, side-by-sideness, and so forth. But even pre-ontologically, in such being as this, the entities which we encounter in concern are proximally hidden. When one designates things as the entities that are proximally given, one goes ontologically astray, even though ontically one has something else in mind. What one really has in mind remains undetermined. But suppose one characterizes these things as things invested with value. What does value mean ontologically? How are we to categorize this investing and being invested? Disregarding the obscurity of this structure of investiture with value, have we thus met that phenomenal characteristic of being which belongs to what we encounter in our concernful dealings? The Greeks had an appropriate term for things, pragmata, things done. That is to say, that which one has to do with in one's concernful dealings, praxis, doing. But ontologically the specifically pragmatic character of the pragmata is just what the Greeks left in obscurity. They thought of these proximally as mere things. We shall call those entities which we encounter in concern equipment. In our dealings we come across equipment for writing, sewing, working, transportation, measurement. The kind of being which equipment possesses must be exhibited. The clue for doing this lies in our first defining what makes an item of equipment, namely its equipmentality. Taken strictly, there is no such thing as an equipment. To the being of any equipment there always belongs a totality of equipment, in which it can be this equipment that it is. Equipment is essentially something in order to, etwas zu. A totality of equipment is constituted by various ways of the in order to, such as serviceability, conduciveness, usability, manipulability. In the in order to, as a structure, there lies an assignment or reference of something to something. Only in the analyses which are to follow can the phenomenon which this term assignment indicates be made visible in its ontological genesis. Provisionally, it is enough to take a look phenomenally at a manifold of such assignments. Equipment, in accordance with its equipmentality, always is in terms of, aus, its belonging to other equipment. Inkstand, pen, ink, paper, blotting pad, table, lamp, furniture, windows, doors, room. These things never show themselves, proximally as they are for themselves, so as to add up to a sum of realia, things which are real, and fill up a room. What we encounter as closest to us, although not as something taken as a theme, is the room, and we encounter it not as something between four walls, in a geometrical spatial sense, but as equipment for residing. Out of this the arrangement emerges, and it is in this that any individual item of equipment shows itself. Before it does so, a totality of equipment has already been discovered. Equipment can genuinely show itself only in dealings cut to its own measure, hammering with a hammer, for example. But in such dealings, an entity of this kind is not grasped thematically as an occurring thing, nor is the equipment structure known as such even in the using. The hammering does not simply have knowledge about, the hammer's character as equipment, but it has appropriated this equipment in a way which could not possibly be more suitable. In dealing such as this, where something is put to use, our concern subordinates itself to the in order to, which is constitutive for the equipment we are employing at the time. The less we just stare at the hammer thing, and the more we seize hold of it and use it, the more primordial does our relationship to it become, and the more unveiledly is it encountered as that which it is, as equipment. The hammering itself uncovers this specific manipulability, Handlichkeit, of the hammer. The kind of being which equipment possesses, in which it manifests itself in its own right, we call readiness to hand, Zuhandenheit. Only because equipment has this being in itself and does not merely occur is it manipulable in the broadest sense and at our disposal. No matter how sharply we just look, nur noch hinsehen, at the outward appearance, Aussehen, of things in whatever form this takes, we cannot discover anything ready to hand. If we look at things just theoretically, we can get along without understanding readiness to hand. But when we deal with them by using them and manipulating them, this activity is not a blind one. It has its own kind of sight, by which our manipulation is guided and from which it acquires its specific thingly character. Dealings with equipment subordinate themselves to the manifold assignments of the in order to, and the sight with which they thus accommodate themselves is circumspection. Practical behavior is not a-theoretical in the sense of sightlessness. The way it differs from theoretical behavior does not lie simply in the fact that in theoretical behavior one observes, while in practical behavior one acts, gehandelt wird, and that action must employ theoretical cognition if it is not to remain blind. For the fact that observation is a kind of concern is just as primordial as the fact that action has its own kind of sight. Theoretical behavior is just looking, without circumspection. But the fact that this looking is non-circumspective does not mean that it follows no rules. It constructs a canon for itself in the form of method. The ready-to-hand is not grasped theoretically at all, nor is it itself the sort of thing that circumspection takes proximally as a circumspective theme. The peculiarity of what is proximally ready to hand is that, in its readiness to hand, it must, as it were, withdraw, zurückziehen, in order to be ready to hand quite authentically. That with which our everyday dealings proximally dwell is not the tools themselves, die Werkzeuge selbst. On the contrary, that with which we concern ourselves primarily is the work, that which is to be produced at the time. And this is accordingly ready to hand, too. The work bears with it that referential totality within which the equipment is encountered. The work to be produced as the towards which of such things as the hammer, the plane, and the needle, likewise has the kind of being that belongs to equipment. The shoe which is to be produced is for wearing, footgear, Schuhzeug. The clock is manufactured for telling the time. The work which we chiefly encounter in our concernful dealings, the work that is to be found when one is at work on something, das in Arbeit befindliche, has a usability which belongs to it essentially. In this usability it lets us encounter already the towards which for which it is usable. A work that someone has ordered, das bestellte Werk, is only by reason of its use and the assignment context of entities which is discovered in using it. But the work to be produced is not merely usable for something. The production itself is a using of something for something. In the work there is also a reference or assignment to materials. The work is dependent on, angewiesen auf, leather, thread, needles, and the like. Leather, moreover, is produced from hides. These are taken from animals, which someone else has raised. Animals also occur within the world without having been raised at all, and, in a way, these entities still produce themselves even when they have been raised. So in the environment, certain entities become accessible which are always ready to hand, but which in themselves do not need to be produced. Hammer, tongs, and needle refer in themselves to steel, iron, metal, mineral, wood, in that they consist of these. In equipment that is used, nature is discovered along with it by that use, the nature we find in natural products. Here, however, nature is not to be understood as that which is just present at hand, nor as the power of nature. The wood is a forest of timber, the mountain a quarry of rock, the river is water power, the wind is wind in the sails. As the environment is discovered, the nature thus discovered is encountered too. If its kind of being as ready to hand is disregarded, this nature itself can be discovered and defined simply in its pure presence at hand. But when this happens, the nature which stirs and strives, which assails us and enthralls us as landscape, remains hidden. The botanist's plants are not the flowers of the hedgerow. The source, which the geographer establishes for a river, is not the spring-head in the dale. The work produced refers not only to the towards which, of its usability, and the whereof, of which it consists. Under simple craft conditions it also has an assignment to the person who is to use it or wear it. The work is cut to his figure. He is there along with it as the work emerges. Even when goods are produced by the dozen, this constitutive assignment is by no means lacking. It is merely indefinite, and points to the random, the average. Thus, along with the work, we encounter not only entities ready to hand, but also entities with Dasein's kind of being, entities for which, in their concern, the product becomes ready to hand. And together with these we encounter the world in which wearers and users live, which is at the same time ours. Any work with which one concerns oneself is ready to hand not only in the domestic world of the workshop, but also in the public world. Along with the public world, the environing nature, die Umweltnatur, is discovered and is accessible to everyone. In roads, streets, bridges, buildings, our concern discovers nature as having some definite direction. A covered railway platform takes account of bad weather. An installation for public lighting takes account of the darkness, or rather of specific changes in the presence or absence of daylight, the position of the sun. In a clock, account is taken of some definite constellation in the world system. When we look at the clock, we tacitly make use of the sun's position, in accordance with which the measurement of time gets regulated in the official astronomical manner. When we make use of the clock equipment, which is proximally and inconspicuously ready to hand, the environing nature is ready to hand along with it. Our concernful absorption in whatever work world lies closest to us has a function of discovering, and it is essential to this function that, depending on the way in which we are absorbed, those entities within the world which are brought along, beigebrachte, in the work, and with it, that is to say, in the assignments or references which are constitutive for it, remain discoverable in varying degrees of explicitness and with a varying circumspective penetration. The kind of being which belongs to these entities is readiness to hand, but this characteristic is not to be understood as merely a way of taking them, as if we were talking such aspects into the entities which we proximally encounter, or as if some world stuff, which is proximally present at hand, in itself were given subjective colouring in this way. Such an interpretation would overlook the fact that in this case these entities would have to be understood and discovered beforehand, as something purely present at hand, and must have priority and take the lead in the sequence of those dealings with the world in which something is discovered and made one's own. But this already runs counter to the ontological meaning of cognition, which we have exhibited as a founded mode of being in the world. To lay bare what is just present at hand and no more, cognition must first penetrate beyond what is ready to hand in our concern. Readiness to hand is the way in which entities, as they are in themselves, are defined ontologico-categorially. Yet only by reason of something present at hand is there anything ready to hand. Does it follow, however, granting this thesis for the nonce, that readiness to hand is ontologically founded upon presence at hand? But even if, as our ontological interpretation proceeds further, readiness to hand should prove itself to be the kind of being characteristic of those entities which are proximally discovered within the world, and even if its primordiality, as compared with pure presence at hand, can be demonstrated, have all these explications been of the slightest help towards understanding the phenomenon of the world ontologically? In interpreting these entities within the world, however, we have always presupposed the world. Even if we join them together, we still do not get anything like the world as their sum. If then we start with the being of these entities, is there any avenue that will lead us to exhibiting the phenomenon of the world? Phenomenon of the world. Phenomenon of the world. Section 16. How the worldly character of the environment announces itself in entities within the world. The world itself is not an entity within the world, and yet it is so determinative for such entities that only insofar as there is a world can they be encountered and show themselves, in their being as entities which have been discovered. But in what way is there a world? If Dasein is ontically constituted by being in the world, and if an understanding of the being of itself belongs just as essentially to its being, no matter how indefinite that understanding may be, then does not Dasein have an understanding of the world, a pre-ontological understanding, which indeed can and does get along without explicit ontological insights? With those entities which are encountered within the world, that is to say, with their character as within the world, does not something like the world show itself, for concernful being in the world? Do we not have a pre-phenomenological glimpse of this phenomenon? Do we not always have such a glimpse of it, without having to take it as a theme for ontological interpretation? Has Dasein itself, in the range of its concernful absorption in equipment ready to hand, a possibility of being in which the worldhood of those entities within the world with which it is concerned, in a certain way, lit up for it, along with those entities themselves? If such possibilities of being for Dasein can be exhibited within its concernful dealings, then the way lies open for studying the phenomenon which is thus lit up, and for attempting to hold it at bay, as it were, and to interrogate it as to those structures which show themselves therein. To the everydayness of being in the world there belong certain modes of concern. These permit the entities with which we concern ourselves to be encountered in such a way that the worldly character of what is within the world comes to the fore. When we concern ourselves with something, the entities which are most closely ready to hand may be met as something unusable, not properly adapted for the use we have decided upon. The tool turns out to be damaged or the material unsuitable. In each of these cases, equipment is here ready to hand. We discover its unusability, however, not by looking at it and establishing its properties, but rather by the circumspection of the dealings in which we use it. When its unusability is thus discovered, equipment becomes conspicuous. This conspicuousness presents the ready-to-hand equipment as in a certain unreadiness to hand. But this implies that what cannot be used just lies there, It shows itself as an equipmental thing which looks so and which, in its readiness to hand as looking that way, has constantly been present at hand too. Pure presence at hand announces itself in such equipment, but only to withdraw to the readiness to hand of something with which one concerns oneself. That is to say, of the sort of thing we find when we cannot put it back into repair. This presence at hand of something that cannot be used is still not devoid of all readiness to hand whatsoever. Equipment which is present at hand in this way is still not just a thing which occurs somewhere. The damage to the equipment is still not a mere alteration of a thing, not a change of properties which just occurs in something present at hand. In our concernful dealings, however, we not only come up against unusable things within what is ready to hand already, we also find things which are missing, which not only are not handy, handlich, but are not to hand, zur Hand, at all. Again, to miss something in this way amounts to coming across something unready to hand. When we notice what is unready to hand, that which is ready to hand enters the mode of obtrusiveness. The more urgently, je dringlicher, we need what is missing, and the more authentically it is encountered in its unreadiness to hand, all the more obtrusive, umso aufdringlicher does that which is ready to hand become, so much so indeed that it seems to lose its character of readiness to hand. It reveals itself as something just present at hand, and no more, which cannot be budged without the thing that is missing. The helpless way in which we stand before it is a deficient mode of concern, and as such it uncovers the being just present at hand, and no more, of something ready to hand. In our dealings with the world of our concern, the unready to hand can be encountered not only in the sense of that which is unusable, or simply missing, but as something unready to hand which is not missing at all, and not unusable, but which stands in the way of our concern. That to which our concern refuses to turn, that for which it has no time, is something unready to hand in the manner of what does not belong here, of what has not as yet been attended to. Anything which is unready to hand in this way is disturbing to us, and enables us to see the obstinacy of that with which we must concern ourselves in the first instance before we do anything else. With this obstinacy, the presence at hand of the ready to hand makes itself known in a new way as the being of that which still lies before us and calls for our attending to it. The modes of conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy all have the function of bringing to the fore the characteristic of presence at hand in what is ready to hand. But the ready to hand is not thereby just observed and stared at as something present at hand. The presence at hand which makes itself known is still bound up in the readiness to hand of equipment. Such equipment still does not veil itself in the guise of mere things. It becomes equipment, in the sense of something which one would like to shove out of the way. But in such a tendency to shove things aside, the ready to hand shows itself as still ready to hand in its unswerving presence at hand. Now that we have suggested, however, that the ready to hand is thus encountered under modifications, in which its presence at hand is revealed, how far does this clarify the phenomenon of the world? Even in analyzing these modifications, we have not gone beyond the being of what is within the world, and we've come no closer to the world phenomenon than before. But though we have not as yet grasped it, we have brought ourselves to a point where we can bring it into view. In conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy, that which is ready to hand loses its readiness to hand in a certain way. But in our dealings with what is ready to hand, this readiness to hand is itself understood, though not thematically. It does not vanish simply, but takes its farewell, as it were, in the conspicuousness of the unusable. Readiness to hand still shows itself, and it is precisely here that the worldly character of ready to hand shows itself too. The structure of the being of what is ready to hand as equipment is determined by references or assignments. In a peculiar and obvious manner, the things which are closest to us are in themselves an sich, and they are encountered as in themselves in the concern which makes use of them without noticing them explicitly, the concern which can come up against something unusable. When equipment cannot be used, this implies that the constitutive assignment of the in order to a towards this has been disturbed. The assignments themselves are not observed. They are rather there when we concernfully submit ourselves to them, sich stellen unter sie. But when an assignment has been disturbed, when something is unusable for some purpose, then the assignment becomes explicit. Even now, of course, it has not become explicit as an ontological structure, but it has become explicit ontically for the circumspection which comes up against the damaging of the tool. When an assignment to some particular towards this has been thus circumspectively aroused, we catch sight of the towards this itself, and along with it everything connected with the work, the whole workshop, as that wherein concern always dwells. The context of equipment is lit up not as something never seen before, but as a totality, constantly cited beforehand in circumspection. With this totality, however, the world announces itself. Similarly, when something ready to hand is found missing, though its everyday presence, Zugegensein, has been so obvious that we have never taken any notice of it, this makes a break in those referential contexts which circumspection discovers. Our circumspection comes up against emptiness, and now sees for the first time what the missing article was ready to hand with, and what it was ready to hand for. The environment announces itself afresh. What is thus lit up is not itself just one thing ready to hand among others. Still less is it something present at hand upon which equipment ready to hand is somehow founded. It is itself inaccessible to circumspection, so far as circumspection is always directed towards entities. But in each case it has already been disclosed for circumspection. Disclose and disclosedness will be used as technical terms in the passages that follow, and shall signify to lay open, and the character of having been laid open. Thus to disclose never means anything like to obtain indirectly by inference. That the world does not consist of the ready-to-hand shows itself in the fact, among others, that whenever the world is lit up in the modes of concern which we have been interpreting, the ready-to-hand becomes deprived of its worldhood so that being just present at hand comes to the fore. If, in our everyday concern with the environment, it is to be possible for equipment ready to hand to be encountered in its being in itself, in seinem an sich sein, then those assignments and referential totalities in which our circumspection is absorbed cannot become a theme for that circumspection any more than they can for grasping things thematically but non-circumspectively. If it is to be possible for the ready-to-hand not to emerge from its inconspicuousness, the world must not announce itself. And it is in this that the being in itself of entities which are ready to hand has its phenomenal structure constituted. In such privative expressions as inconspicuousness, unobtrusiveness, and non-obstinacy, what we have in view is a positive phenomenal character of the being of that which is proximally ready to hand. With these negative prefixes we have in view the character of the ready to hand as holding itself in. This is what we have our eye upon in the being in itself of something, though proximally we ascribe it to the present at hand, as that which can be thematically ascertained. As long as we take our orientation primarily and exclusively from the present at hand, the in itself can by no means be ontologically clarified. If, however, this talk about the in itself has any ontological importance, some interpretation must be called for. This in itself of being is something which gets invoked with considerable emphasis, mostly in an ontical way, and rightly so from a phenomenal standpoint. But if some ontological assertion is supposed to be given when this is ontically invoked, its claims are not fulfilled by such a procedure. As the foregoing analysis has already made clear, only on the basis of the phenomenon of the world can the being in itself of entities within the world be grasped ontologically. But if the world can, in a way, be lit up, it must assuredly be disclosed. And it has already been disclosed beforehand whenever what is ready to hand within the world is accessible for circumspective concern. The world is therefore something wherein Dasein, as an entity, already was, and if, in any manner, it explicitly comes away from anything, it can never do more than come back to the world. Being in the world, according to our interpretation hitherto, amounts to a non-thematic circumspective absorption in references or assignments constitutive for the readiness to hand of a totality of equipment. Any concern is already as it is because of some familiarity with the world. In this familiarity, Dasein can lose itself in what it encounters within the world and be fascinated with it. What is it that Dasein is familiar with? Why can the worldly character of what is within the world be lit up? The presence at hand of entities is thrust to the fore by the possible breaks in that referential totality in which circumspection operates. How are we to get a closer understanding of this totality? These questions are aimed at working out both the phenomenon and the problems of worldhood, and they call for an inquiry into the interconnections with which certain structures are built up. To answer them, we must analyze these structures more concretely. Section 17. Reference and Signs. In our provisional interpretation of that structure of being which belongs to the ready-to-hand, to equipment, the phenomenon of reference or assignment became visible. But we merely gave an indication of it, and in so sketchy a form that we at once stressed the necessity of uncovering it with regard to its ontological origin. It became plain, moreover, that assignments and referential totalities could in some sense become constitutive for worldhood itself. Hitherto we have seen the world lit up only in and for certain definite ways in which we concern ourselves environmentally with the ready-to-hand, and indeed it has been lit up only with the readiness to hand of that concern. So the further we proceed in understanding the being of entities within the world, the broader and firmer becomes the phenomenal basis on which the world phenomenon may be laid bare. We shall again take as our point of departure the being of the ready-to-hand, but this time with the purpose of grasping the phenomenon of reference or assignment itself more precisely. We shall accordingly attempt an ontological analysis of a kind of equipment in which one may come across such references in more senses than one. We come across equipment in signs. The word sign designates many kinds of things. Not only may it stand for different kinds of signs, but being a sign for can itself be formalized as a universal kind of relation, so that the sign structure itself provides an ontological clue for characterizing any entity whatsoever. But signs, in the first instance, are themselves items of equipment, whose specific character as equipment consists in showing or indicating. We find such signs in signposts, boundary stones, the ball for the mariner's storm warning, signals, banners, signs of mourning, and the like. Indicating can be defined as a kind of referring. Referring is, if we take it as formally as possible, a relating. But relation does not function as a genus for kinds or species of references, which may somehow become differentiated as sign, symbol, expression, or signification. A relation is something quite formal which may be read off directly by way of formalization from any kind of context, whatever its subject matter or its way of being. Every reference is a relation, but not every relation is a reference. Every indication is a reference, but not every referring is an indicating. This implies at the same time that every indication is a relation, but not every relation is an indicating. The formally general character of relation is thus brought to light. If we are to investigate such phenomena as references, signs, or even significations, Nothing is to be gained by characterizing them as relations. Indeed, we shall eventually have to show that relations themselves, because of their formally general character, have their ontological source in a reference. If the present analysis is to be confined to the interpretation of the sign as distinct from the phenomenon of reference, then even within this limitation we cannot properly investigate the full multiplicity of possible signs. Among signs there are symptoms, Anzeichen, warning signals, signs of things that have happened already, Rückzeichen, signs to mark something, signs by which things are recognized. These have different ways of indicating, regardless of what may be serving as such a sign. From such signs we must distinguish traces, residues, commemorative monuments, documents, testimony, symbols, expressions, appearances, significations. These phenomena can easily be formalized because of their formal relational character. We find it especially tempting nowadays to take such a relation as a clue for subjecting every entity to a kind of interpretation which always fits because at bottom it says nothing, no more than the facile schema of content and form. As an example of a sign, we have chosen one which we shall use again in a later analysis, though in another regard. Motor cars are sometimes fitted up with an adjustable red arrow, whose position indicates the direction the vehicle will take. At an intersection, for instance, the position of the arrow is controlled by the driver. This sign is an item of equipment which is ready to hand for the driver in his concern with driving, and not for him alone. Those who are not travelling with him, and they in particular, also make use of it, either by giving way on the proper side or by stopping. This sign is ready to hand within the world, in the whole equipment context of vehicles and traffic regulations. It is equipment for indicating, and as equipment it is constituted by reference or assignment. It has the character of the in order to, its own definite serviceability. It is for indicating. This indicating which the sign performs can be taken as a kind of referring. But here we must notice that this referring, as indicating, is not the ontological structure of the sign as equipment. Instead, referring as indicating is grounded in the being structure of equipment, in serviceability for. But an entity may have serviceability without thereby becoming a sign. As equipment, a hammer, too, is constituted by a serviceability, but this does not make it a sign. Indicating as a reference is a way in which the towards which of a serviceability becomes ontically concrete. It determines an item of equipment as for this towards which und bestimmt ein Zeug zu diesem. On the other hand, the kind of reference we get in serviceability for is an ontologico-categorial attribute of equipment as equipment. That the towards which of serviceability should acquire its concreteness in indicating is an accident of its equipment constitution as such. In this example of a sign, the difference between the reference of serviceability and the reference of indicating becomes visible in a rough and ready fashion. These are so far from coinciding that only when they are united does the concreteness of a definite kind of equipment become possible. Now, it is certain that indicating differs in principle from reference as a constitutive state of equipment. It is just as incontestable that the sign in its turn is related in a peculiar and even distinctive way to the kind of being which belongs to whatever equipmental totality may be ready to hand in the environment, and to its worldly character. In our concernful dealings, equipment for indicating, Zeigzeug, gets used in a very special way. But simply to establish this fact is ontologically insufficient. The basis and the meaning of this special status must be clarified. What do we mean when we say that a sign indicates? We can answer this only by determining what kind of dealing is appropriate with equipment for indicating, and we must do this in such a way that the readiness to hand of that equipment can be genuinely grasped. What is the appropriate way of having to do with signs? Going back to our example of the arrow, we must say that the kind of being, which corresponds to the sign we encounter, is either to give way or to stand still, vis-à-vis the car with the arrow. Giving way, as taking a direction, belongs essentially to Daseins, being in the world. Dasein is always somehow directed, ausgerichtet, and on its way. Standing and waiting are only limiting cases of this directional on its way. The sign addresses itself to a being in the world which is specifically spatial. The sign is not authentically grasped, erfasst, if we just stare at it and identify it as an indicator thing which occurs. Even if we turn our glance in the direction which the arrow indicates and look at something present at hand in the region indicated, even then the sign is not authentically encountered. Such a sign addresses itself to the circumspection of our concernful dealings. And it does so in such a way that the circumspection which goes along with it, following where it points, brings into an explicit survey whatever aroundness the environment may have at the time. This circumspective survey does not grasp the ready-to-hand. What it achieves is rather an orientation within our environment. There is also another way in which we can experience equipment. We may encounter the arrow simply as equipment which belongs to the car. We can do this without discovering what character it specifically has as equipment. What the arrow is to indicate and how it is to do so may remain completely undetermined. Yet what we are encountering is not a mere thing. The experiencing of a thing requires a definiteness of its own, ihre eigene Bestimmtheit, and must be contrasted with coming across a manifold of equipment, which may often be quite indefinite, even when one comes across it as especially close. Signs of the kind we have described let what is ready to hand be encountered. More precisely, they let some context of it become accessible in such a way that our concernful dealings take on an orientation and hold it secure. A sign is not a thing which stands to another thing in the relationship of indicating. It is rather an item of equipment which explicitly raises a totality of equipment into our circumspection, so that together with it, the worldly character of the ready-to-hand announces itself. In a symptom or a warning signal, what is coming indicates itself, but not in the sense of something merely occurring, which comes as an addition to what is already present at hand. What is coming is the sort of thing which we are ready for, or which we weren't ready for, if we have been attending to something else. In signs of something that has happened already, what has come to pass and run its course becomes circumspectively accessible. A sign to mark something indicates what one is at any time. Signs always indicate primarily wherein one lives, where one's concern dwells, what sort of involvement there is with something. The peculiar character of signs as equipment becomes especially clear in establishing a sign, Zeichenstiftung. This activity is performed in a circumspective foresight, Vorsicht, out of which it arises, and which requires that it be possible for one's particular environment to announce itself for circumspection at any time by means of something ready to hand, and that this possibility should itself be ready to hand. But the being of what is most closely ready to hand within the world possesses the character of holding itself in, and not emerging, which we have described above. Accordingly, our circumspective dealings in the environment require some equipment ready to hand, which, in its character as equipment, takes over the work of letting something ready to hand become conspicuous. So when such equipment, signs, gets produced, its conspicuousness must be kept in mind. But even when signs are thus conspicuous, one does not let them be present at hand at random. They get set up, angebracht, in a definite way with a view towards easy accessibility. In establishing a sign, however, one does not necessarily have to produce equipment which is not yet ready to hand at all. Signs also arise when one takes as a sign, zum Zeichen nehmen, something that is ready to hand already. In this mode, signs get established in a sense which is even more primordial. In indicating a ready-to-hand equipment totality, and even the environment in general, can be provided with an availability which is circumspectively oriented. And not only this, establishing a sign can, above all, reveal. What gets taken as a sign becomes accessible only through its readiness to hand. If, for instance, the south wind is accepted, gilt, by the farmer as a sign of rain, then this acceptance, Geltung, or the value with which the entity is invested, is not a sort of bonus over and above what is already present at hand in itself, namely the flow of air in a definite geographical direction. The south wind may be meteorologically accessible as something which just occurs, but it is never present at hand proximally in such a way as this, only occasionally taking over the function of a warning signal. On the contrary, only by the circumspection with which one takes account of things in farming is the south wind discovered in its being. But one will protest that which gets taken as a sign must first have become accessible in itself, and been apprehended before the sign gets established. Certainly it must in any case be such that in some way we can come across it. The question simply remains as to how entities are discovered in this previous encountering, whether as mere things which occur, or rather as equipment which has not been understood, as something ready to hand with which we have hitherto not known how to begin, and which has accordingly kept itself veiled from the purview of circumspection. And here again, when the equipmental characters of the ready-to-hand are still circumspectively undiscovered, they are not to be interpreted as bare thinghood presented for an apprehension of what is just present at hand, and no more. The being ready to hand of signs in our everyday dealings, and for conspicuousness which belongs to signs and which may be produced for various purposes and in various ways, do not merely serve to document the inconspicuousness constitutive for what is most closely ready to hand. The sign itself gets its conspicuousness from the inconspicuousness of the equipmental totality, which is ready to hand and obvious in its everydayness. The knot which one ties in a handkerchief, der bekannte Knopf im Taschentuch, as a sign to mark something, is an example of this. What such a sign is to indicate is always something with which one has to concern oneself in one's everyday circumspection. Such a sign can indicate many things, and things of the most various kinds. The wider the extent to which it can indicate, the narrower its intelligibility and its usefulness. Not only is it, for the most part, ready to hand as a sign only for the person who establishes it, but it can even become inaccessible to him, so that another sign is needed if the first is to be used circumspectively at all. So when the knot cannot be used as a sign, it does not lose its sign character, but it acquires the disturbing obtrusiveness of something most closely ready to hand. One might be tempted to cite the abundant use of signs in primitive Dasein, as in fetishism and magic, to illustrate the remarkable role which they play in everyday concern when it comes to our understanding of the world. Certainly the establishment of signs which underlies this way of using them is not performed with any theoretical aim, or in the course of theoretical speculation. This way of using them always remains completely within a being in the world which is immediate. But on closer inspection it becomes plain that to interpret fetishism and magic, by taking our clue from the idea of signs in general, is not enough to enable us to grasp the kind of being ready to hand which belongs to entities encountered in the primitive world. With regard to the sign phenomenon, the following interpretation may be given. For primitive man, the sign coincides with that which is indicated. Not only can the sign represent this in the sense of serving as a substitute for what it indicates, but it can do so in such a way that the sign itself always is what it indicates. This remarkable coinciding does not mean, however, that the sign thing has already undergone a certain objectification, that it has been experienced as a mere thing and misplaced into the same realm of being of the present at hand as what it indicates. This coinciding is not an identification of things which have hitherto been isolated from each other. It consists rather in the fact that the sign has not as yet become free from that of which it is a sign. Such a use of signs is still absorbed completely in being towards what is indicated, so that a sign as such cannot detach itself at all. This coinciding is based not on a prior objectification, but on the fact that such objectification is completely lacking. This means, however, that signs are not discovered as equipment at all, that ultimately what is ready to hand within the world just does not have the kind of being that belongs to equipment. Perhaps even readiness to hand and equipment have nothing to contribute, nichts auszurichten, as ontological clues in interpreting the primitive world. And certainly the ontology of thinghood does even less. But if an understanding of being is constitutive for primitive Dasein, and for the primitive world in general, then it is all the more urgent to work out the formal idea of worldhood, or at least the idea of phenomenon modifiable in such a way that all ontological assertions to the effect that in a given phenomenal context something is not yet such and such, or no longer such and such, may acquire a positive phenomenal meaning in terms of what it is not. The foregoing interpretation of the sign should merely provide phenomenal support for our characterization of references or assignments. The relation between sign and reference is threefold. 1. Indicating as a way whereby the towards which of a serviceability can become concrete, is founded upon the equipment structure as such, upon the in order to assignment. 2. The indicating, which the sign does, is an equipmental character of something ready to hand, and as such it belongs to a totality of equipment, to a context of assignments or references. 3. The sign is not only ready to hand with other equipment, but in its readiness to hand, the environment becomes in each case explicitly accessible for circumspection. A sign is something ontically ready to hand, which functions both as this definite equipment and as something indicative of, was anzeigt, the ontological structure of readiness to hand, of referential totalities, and of worldhood. Here is rooted the special status of the sign as something ready to hand, in that environment with which we concern ourselves circumspectively. Thus, the reference or the assignment itself cannot be conceived as a sign of it, is to serve ontologically as the foundation upon which signs are based. Reference is not an ontical characteristic of something ready to hand, when it is rather that by which readiness to hand itself is constituted. In what sense, then, is reference presupposed ontologically in the ready to hand, and to what extent is it, as such an ontological foundation, at the same time constitutive for worldhood in general? Section 18. Involvement and Significance. The worldhood of the world. The ready-to-hand is encountered within the world. The being of this entity, readiness to hand, thus stands in some ontological relationship towards the world and towards worldhood. In anything ready to hand, the world is always there. Whenever we encounter anything, the world has already been previously discovered, though not thematically. But it can also be lit up in certain ways of dealing with our environment. The world is that in terms of which the ready-to-hand is ready to hand. How can the world let the ready-to-hand be encountered? Our analysis hitherto has shown that what we encounter within the world has, in its very being, been freed for our concernful circumspection, for taking account. What does this previous freeing amount to, and how is this to be understood as an ontologically distinctive feature of the world? What problems does the question of the worldhood of the world lay before us? We have indicated that the state which is constitutive for the ready-to-hand as equipment is one of reference or assignment. How can entities with this kind of being be freed by the world with regard to their being? Why are these the first entities to be encountered? As definite kinds of references, we have mentioned serviceability for, detrimentality, Abträglichkeit, usability, and the like, the towards which, das wozu, of a serviceability, and the for which, das wofür, of a usability, prescribe the ways in which such a reference or assignment can become concrete. But the indicating of the sign and the hammering of the hammer are not properties of entities. Indeed, they are not properties at all, if the ontological structure designated by the term property is that of some definite character which it is possible for things to possess, eine möglichen Bestimmtheit von Dingen. Anything ready to hand is, at the worst, appropriate for some purposes and inappropriate for others. And its properties are, as it were, still bound up in these ways in which it is appropriate or inappropriate, just as presence at hand and as a possible kind of being for something ready to hand is bound up in readiness to hand. Serviceability too, however, as a constitutive state of equipment, and serviceability as a reference, is not an appropriateness of some entity. It is rather the condition, so far as being is in question, which makes it possible for the character of such an entity to be defined by its appropriateness. But what, then, is reference or assignment to mean? To say that the being of the ready-to-hand has the structure of assignment or reference means that it has in itself the character of having been assigned or referred, Verwiesenheit. An entity is discovered when it has been assigned or referred to something, and referred as that entity which it is. With any such entity there is an involvement which it has in something. The character of being which belongs to the ready-to-hand is just such an involvement. If something has an involvement, this implies letting it be involved in something. The relationship of the with, in, shall be indicated by the term assignment or reference. When an entity within the world has already been proximally freed for its being, that being is its involvement. With any such entity as entity there is some involvement. The fact that it has such an involvement is ontologically definitive for the being of such an entity, and is not an ontical assertion about it. That in which it is involved is the towards which of serviceability and the for which of usability. With the towards which of serviceability there can again be an involvement. With this thing, for instance, which is ready to hand and which we accordingly call a hammer, there is an involvement in hammering. With hammering there is an involvement in making something fast. With making something fast there is an involvement in protection against bad weather. And this protection is, for the sake of, Willen, providing shelter for Dasein, that is to say, for the sake of a possibility of Dasein's being. Whenever something ready to hand has an involvement with it, what involvement this is has in each case been outlined in advance in terms of the totality of such involvements. In a workshop, for example, the totality of involvements which is constitutive for the ready to hand in its readiness to hand is earlier than any single item of equipment. So too for the farmstead with all its utensils and outlying lands. But the totality of involvements itself goes back ultimately to a towards which, in which there is no further involvement. This towards which is not an entity with the kind of being that belongs to what is ready to hand within a world. It is rather an entity whose being is defined as being in the world, and to whose state of being worldhood itself belongs. This primary towards which is not just another towards this, as something in which an involvement is possible. The primary towards which is a for the sake of which, but the for the sake of always pertains to the being of Dasein, for which, in its being, that very being is essentially an issue. We have thus indicated the interconnection by which the structure of an involvement leads to Dasein's very being as the sole authentic for the sake of which. For the present, however, we shall pursue this no further. Letting something be involved must first be clarified enough to give the phenomenon of worldhood the kind of definiteness which makes it possible to formulate any problems about it. Ontically, letting something be involved signifies that, within our factical concern, we let something ready to hand be so and so, as it is already, and in order that it be such. The way we take this ontical sense of letting be is in principle ontological, and therewith we interpret the meaning of previously freeing what is proximally ready to hand within the world. Previously letting something be does not mean that we must first bring it into its being and produce it. It means rather that something which is already an entity must be discovered in its readiness to hand, and that we must thus let the entity which has this being be encountered. This a priori, letting something be involved, is the condition for the possibility of encountering anything ready to hand, so that Dasein, in its ontical dealings with the entity thus encountered, can thereby let it be involved in the ontical sense. On the other hand, if letting something be involved is understood ontologically, what is then pertinent is the freeing of everything ready to hand as ready to hand, no matter whether, taken ontically, it is involved thereby, or whether it is rather an entity of precisely such a sort that ontically it is not involved thereby. Such entities are proximally, and for the most part, those with which we concern ourselves when we do not let them be, as we have discovered that they are, but work upon them, make improvements in them, or smash them to pieces. When we speak of having already let something be involved, so that it has been freed for that involvement, we are using a perfect tense, a priori, which characterizes the kind of being belonging to Dasein itself. Letting an entity be involved, if we understand this ontologically, consists in previously freeing it for, auf, its readiness to hand within the environment. When we let something be involved, it must be involved in something, and in terms of this in which, the with which of this involvement is freed. Our concern encounters it as this thing that is ready to hand. To the extent that any entity shows itself to concern, that is, to the extent that it is discovered in its being, it is already something ready to hand environmentally. It just is not proximally a world stuff that is merely present at hand. As the being of something ready to hand, an involvement is itself discovered only on the basis of the prior discovery of a totality of involvements. So, in any involvement that has been discovered, that is, in anything ready to hand which we encounter, what we have called the worldly character of the ready to hand has been discovered beforehand. In this totality of involvements which has been discovered beforehand, there lurks an ontological relationship to the world. In letting entities be involved, so that they are freed for a totality of involvements, one must have disclosed already that for which, woraufhin, they have been freed. But that for which something environmentally ready to hand has thus been freed, and indeed in such a manner that it becomes accessible as an entity within the world first of all, cannot itself be conceived as an entity with this discovered kind of being. It is essentially not discoverable, if we henceforth reserve discoveredness as a term for a possibility of being which every entity without the character of Dasein may possess. But what does it mean to say that that for which entities within the world are proximally freed must have been previously disclosed? To Dasein's being an understanding of being belongs. Any understanding, Verständnis, has its being in an act of understanding, Verstehen. If being in the world is a kind of being which is essentially befitting to Dasein, then to understand being in the world belongs to the essential content of its understanding of being. The previous disclosure of that for which what we encounter within the world is subsequently freed amounts to nothing else than understanding the world, that world towards which Dasein as an entity always comports itself. Whenever we let there be an involvement with something in something beforehand, our doing so is grounded in our understanding such things as letting something be involved, and such things as the with which and the in which of involvements. Anything of this sort, and anything else that is basic for it, such as the towards this, as that in which there is an involvement, or such as the for the sake of which, to which every towards which ultimately goes back, all these must be disclosed beforehand with a certain intelligibility, Verständlichkeit. And what is that wherein Dasein as being in the world understands itself pre-ontologically? In understanding a context of relations such as we have mentioned, Dasein has assigned itself to an in order to, zu, and it has done so in terms of a potentiality for being, for the sake of which it itself is, one which it may have seized upon either explicitly or tacitly, and which may be either authentic or inauthentic. This in order to prescribes a towards this as a possible in which, for letting something be involved, and the structure of letting it be involved implies that this is an involvement which something has, an involvement which is with something. Dasein always assigns itself from a for the sake of which to the with which of an involvement. That is to say, to the extent that it is, it always lets entities be encountered as ready to hand. That wherein, worin, Dasein understands itself beforehand in the mode of assigning itself, is that for which, das woraufhin, it has let entities be encountered beforehand. The wherein of an act of understanding which assigns or refers itself is that for which one lets entities be encountered in the kind of being that belongs to involvements. And this wherein is the phenomenon of the world. And the structure of that to which woraufhin Dasein assigns itself is what makes up the worldhood of the world. That wherein Dasein already understands itself in this way is always something with which it is primordially familiar. This familiarity with the world does not necessarily require that the relations which are constitutive for the world, as world, should be theoretically transparent. However, the possibility of giving these relations an explicit ontologico-existential interpretation is grounded in this familiarity with the world. And this familiarity in turn is constitutive for Dasein, and goes to make up Dasein's understanding of being. This possibility is one which can be seized upon explicitly insofar as Dasein has set itself the task of giving a primordial interpretation for its own being, and for the possibilities of that being, or indeed for the meaning of being in general. But as yet our analyses have done no more than lay bare the horizon within which such things as the world and worldhood are to be sought. If we are to consider these further, we must, in the first instance, make it still more clear how the context of Dasein's assigning itself is to be taken ontologically. In the act of understanding, verstehen, which we shall analyze more thoroughly later, the relations indicated above must have been previously disclosed. The act of understanding holds them in this disclosedness. It holds itself in them with familiarity, and in so doing it holds them before itself, for it is in these that its assignment operates. The understanding lets itself make assignments both in these relationships themselves and of them. The relational character which these relationships of assigning possess we take as one of signifying. In its familiarity with these relationships, Dasein signifies to itself. In a primordial manner it gives itself both its being and its potentiality for being as something which it is to understand with regard to its being in the world. The for sake of which signifies an in order to, this in turn a towards this, the latter an in which, of letting something be involved, and that in turn the with which of an involvement. These relationships are bound up with one another as a primordial totality. They are what they are as this signifying, bedeuten, in which Dasein gives itself beforehand its being in the world as something to be understood. The relational totality of this signifying we call significance. This is what makes up the structure of the world, the structure of that wherein Dasein as such already is. Dasein, in its familiarity with significance, is the ontical condition for the possibility of discovering entities which are encountered in a world with involvement, readiness to hand, as their kind of being, and which can thus make themselves known as they are in themselves, in seinem Ansich. Dasein as such is always something of this sort. Along with its being, a context of the ready-to-hand is already essentially discovered. Dasein, insofar as it is, has always submitted itself already to a world which it encounters, and this submission belongs essentially to its being. But in significance itself, with which Dasein is always familiar, there lurks the ontological condition which makes it possible for Dasein, as something which understands and interprets, to disclose such things as significations. Upon these, in turn, is founded the being of words and of language. The significance thus disclosed is an existential state of Dasein, of its being in the world, and as such it is the ontical condition for the possibility that a totality of involvements can be discovered. If we have thus determined that the being of the ready-to-hand, involvement, is definable as a context of assignments or references, and that even worldhood may so be defined, then has not the substantial being of entities within the world been volatilized into a system of relations? And inasmuch as relations are always something thought, has not the being of entities within the world been dissolved into pure thinking? Within our present field of investigation, the following structures and dimensions of ontological problematics, as we have repeatedly emphasized, must be kept in principle distinct. 1. The being of those entities within the world which we proximally encounter, readiness to hand. 2. The being of those entities which we can come across, and whose nature we can determine if we discover them in their own right by going through the entities proximally encountered, presence at hand. 3. The being of that ontical condition which makes it possible for entities within the world to be discovered at all, the worldhood of the world. This third kind of being gives us an existential way of determining the nature of being in the world, that is, of Dasein. The other two concepts of being are categories, and pertain to entities whose being is not of the kind which Dasein possesses. The context of assignments or references, which as significance is constitutive for worldhood, can be taken formally in the sense of a system of relations. But one must note that in such formalizations the phenomena get levelled off so much that their real phenomenal content may be lost, especially in the case of such simple relationships as those which lurk in significance. The phenomenal content of these relations and relata, the in order to, the for the sake of, and the with which of an involvement, is such that they resist any sort of mathematical functionalization. Nor are they merely something thought, first posited in an act of thinking. They are rather relationships in which concernful circumspection as such already dwells. This system of relations, as something constitutive for worldhood, is so far from volatilizing the being of the ready-to-hand within the world, that the worldhood of the world provides the basis on which such entities can for the first time be discovered as they are substantially in themselves. And only if entities within the world can be encountered at all is it possible, in the field of such entities, to make accessible what is just present at hand and no more. By reason of their being just present at hand and no more, these latter entities can have their properties defined mathematically in functional concepts. Ontologically, such concepts are possible only in relation to entities whose being has the character of pure substantiality. Functional concepts are never possible except as formalized, substantial concepts. In order to bring out the specifically ontological problematic of worldhood even more sharply, we shall carry our analysis no further until we have clarified our interpretation of worldhood by a case at the opposite extreme. B. A contrast between our analysis of worldhood and Descartes' interpretation of the world. Only step by step can the concept of worldhood and the structures which this phenomenon embraces be firmly secured in the course of our investigation. The interpretation of the world begins in the first instance with some entity within the world, so that the phenomenon of the world in general no longer comes into view. We shall accordingly try to clarify this approach ontologically by considering what is perhaps the most extreme form in which it has been carried out. We not only shall present briefly the basic features of Descartes' ontology of the world, but shall inquire into its presuppositions and try to characterize these in the light of what we have hitherto achieved. The account we shall give of these matters will enable us to know upon what basically undiscussed ontological foundations those interpretations of the world which have come after Descartes, and still more those which preceded him, have operated. Descartes sees the extensio as basically definitive ontologically for the world. Insofar as extension is one of the constituents of spatiality, according to Descartes it is even identical with it, while in some sense spatiality remains constitutive for the world, a discussion of the Cartesian ontology of the world will provide us likewise with a negative support for a positive explication of the spatiality of the environment and of Dasein itself. With regard to Descartes' ontology, there are three topics which we shall treat. 1. The definition of the world as res extensa. 2. The foundations of this ontological definition. 3. A hermeneutical discussion of the Cartesian ontology of the world. The considerations which follow will not have been grounded in full detail until the cogito sum has been phenomenologically destroyed. Section 19. The definition of the world as res extensa, an extended thing. Descartes distinguishes the ego cogito, I who think, from the res corporea, the thing which has a body. This distinction will thereafter be determinative ontologically for the distinction between nature and spirit. No matter with how many variations of content the opposition between nature and spirit may get set up ontically, its ontological foundations, and indeed the very poles of this opposition, remain unclarified. This unclarity has its proximate, nächste, roots in Descartes' distinction. What kind of understanding of being does he have when he defines the being of these entities? The term for the being of an entity that is in itself is substantia, substance. Sometimes this expression means the being of an entity as substance, substantiality. At other times it means the entity itself, a substance. That substantia is used in these two ways is not accidental. This already holds for the ancient conception of ousia, presence. To determine the nature of the res corporea, the thing which has a body, ontologically, we must explicate the substance of this entity as a substance, that is, its substantiality. What makes up the authentic being in itself, an im selbst sein of the res corporea? How is it at all possible to grasp a substance as such, that is, to grasp its substantiality? In Principia Philosophiae, Descartes said, "And though substance is indeed known by some attribute, yet for each substance there is preeminently one property which constitutes its nature and essence, and to which all the rest are referred." Which property is this in the case of the res corporea? Descartes says further, indeed, extension in length, breadth, and thickness constitutes the nature of corporeal substance. What gives the extensio this distinctive status? Descartes says, for everything else that can be ascribed to body presupposes extension. Extension is a state of being constitutive for the entity we are talking about. It is that which must already be before any other ways in which being is determined. So that these can be what they are, extension must be assigned, zugewiesen, primarily to the corporeal thing. The world's extension and substantiality, which itself is characterized by extension, are accordingly demonstrated by showing how all the other characteristics which this substance definitely possesses, especially divisio, figura, motus, division, shape, motion, can be conceived of only as modi of extensio, modes, forms of extension, while on the other hand, extensio sine figura vel motu, extension without shape or motion, remains quite intelligible. Thus, a corporeal thing that maintains its total extension can still undergo many changes in the way in which that extension is distributed in the various dimensions, and can present itself in manifold shapes as one and the same thing. Descartes says, and one and the same body can be extended in many different ways while retaining the same quantity it had before. Surely it can sometimes be greater in length and less in breadth or thickness, while later it may, on the contrary, be greater in breadth and less in length. Shape is a modus of extensio, and so is motion, for motus is grasped only if we think of nothing except what has a place, and do not ask about the force by which it is set in motion, Descartes. If the motion is a property of the res corporea, and a property which is, then, in order for it to be experienceable in its being, it must be conceived in terms of the being of this entity itself, in terms of extensio. This means that it must be conceived as mere change of location. So nothing like force counts for anything in determining what the being of this entity is. Matter may have such definite characteristics as hardness, weight, and color. But these can all be taken away from it, and it still remains what it is. These do not go to make up its real being, and insofar as they are, they turn out to be modes of extensio. Descartes tries to show this in detail with regard to hardness. For so far as hardness is concerned, the sense shows us nothing else about it than that portions of hard bodies resist the movement of our hands when they come up against these portions. For if, whenever our hands are moved towards a certain portion, all the bodies there should retreat with the same velocity as that with which our hands approach, we should never feel any hardness, nor is it in any way intelligible that bodies which thus recede should accordingly lose their corporeal nature. Hence this does not consist in hardness. Hardness is experienced when one feels one's way by touch, tasten. What does the sense of touch tell us about it? The parts of the hard thing resist a movement of the hand, such as an attempt to push it away. If, however, hard bodies, those which do not give way, should change their locations with the same velocity as that of the hand which strikes at them, nothing would ever get touched, berühren, and hardness would not be experienced, and would accordingly never be. But it is quite incomprehensible that bodies which give way with such velocity should thus forfeit any of their corporeal being. If they retain this even under a change in velocity which makes it impossible for anything like hardness to be, then hardness does not belong to the being of entities of this sort. Descartes says, and by the same reasoning it can be shown that weight and color and all the other qualities of this sort, which are sensed in corporeal matter, can be taken away from it, while that matter remains entire. It follows that the nature of this, that is, of extension, depends on none of these. Thus, what makes up the being of the res corporea is the extensio, that which is omnimodo divisibile, figurabile et mobile, that which can change itself by being divided, shaped, or moved in any way, that which is capax mutationem, capable of change, that which maintains itself, remanet, through all these changes. In any corporeal thing, the real entity is what is suited for thus remaining constant, ständigen Verbleib, so much so, indeed, that this is how the substantiality of such a substance gets characterized. Section 20. Foundations of the ontological definition of the world. Substantiality is the idea of being to which the ontological characterization of the res extensa harks back. Descartes says, by substance we can understand nothing else than an entity which is in such a way that it needs no other entity in order to be. The being of a substance is characterized by not needing anything. That whose being is such that it has no need at all for any other entity satisfies the idea of substance in the authentic sense. This entity is the ens perfectissimum, the most perfect being. Descartes says, only one substance which is in need of nothing whatsoever can be understood, and this indeed is God. Here, God is a purely ontological term, if it is to be understood as ens perfectissimum. At the same time, the self-evident connotation of the concept of God is such as to permit an ontological interpretation for the characteristic of not needing anything, a constitutive item in substantiality. Descartes says, indeed we perceive that other things cannot exist without the help of God's concurrence. All entities other than God need to be produced, in the widest sense, and also to be sustained. Being is to be understood within a horizon which ranges from the production of what is to be present at hand to something which has no need of being produced. Every entity which is not God is an ens creatum. The being which belongs to one of these entities is infinitely different from that which belongs to the other. Yet we still consider creation and creator alike as entities. We are thus using being in so wide a sense that its meaning embraces an infinite difference. So even created entities can be called substance with some right. Relative to God, of course, these entities need to be produced and sustained. But within the realm of created entities, the world in the sense of ens creatum, there are things which are in need of no other entity, relatively to the creaturely production and sustentation that we find, for instance, in man. Of these substances there are two kinds, the res cogitans and the res extensa. The being of that substance, whose distinctive proprietas is presented by extensio, thus becomes definable in principle ontologically, if we clarify the meaning of being which is common to the three kinds of substances, one of them infinite, the others both finite. But, as Descartes says, the name substance is not appropriate to God and to these univocally, as they say in the schools. That is, no signification of this name, which would be common to both God and his creation, can be distinctly understood. Here Descartes touches upon a problem with which medieval ontology was often busied, the question of how the signification of being signifies any entity which one may on occasion be considering. In the assertions God is, and the world is, we assert being. This word is, however, cannot be meant to apply to these entities in the same sense, when between them there is an infinite difference of being. If the signification of is were univocal, then what is created would be viewed as if it were uncreated, or the uncreated would be reduced to the status of something created. But neither does being function as a mere name, which is the same in both cases. In both cases, being is understood. This positive sense in which being signifies is one which the schoolmen took as a signification by analogy, as distinguished from one which is univocal or merely homonymous. Taking their departure from Aristotle, in whom this problem is foreshadowed in prototypical form, just as at the very outset of Greek ontology, they established various kinds of analogy, so that even the schools have different ways of taking the signification function of being. In working out this problem ontologically, Descartes is always far behind the schoolmen. Indeed, he evades the question. He says, "Yet substance cannot first be discovered merely by the fact that it is a thing that exists, for this alone by itself does not affect us." This evasion is tantamount to his failing to discuss the meaning of being which the idea of substantiality embraces, or the character of the universality which belongs to this signification. Of course, even the ontology of the medievals has gone no further than that of the ancients in inquiring into what being itself may mean. So it is not surprising if no headway is made with a question like that of the way in which being signifies, as long as this has to be discussed on the basis of an unclarified meaning of being, which this signification expresses. The meaning remains unclarified because it is held to be self-evident. Descartes not only evades the ontological question of substantiality altogether, he also emphasizes explicitly that substance as such, that is to say, its substantiality, is in and for itself inaccessible from the outset, vorgängig. He says, no significance of this name, substance, which would be common to God and his creation, can be distinctly understood. Being itself does not affect us, and therefore cannot be perceived. Being is not a real predicate, says Kant, who is merely repeating Descartes' principle. Thus, the possibility of a pure problematic of being gets renounced in principle, and a way is sought for arriving at those definite characteristics of substance which we have designated above. Because being is not in fact accessible as an entity, it is expressed through attributes, definite characteristics of the entities under consideration, characteristics which themselves are. Being is not expressed through just any such characteristics, but rather through those satisfying in the purest manner that meaning of being and substantiality which has still been tacitly presupposed. To the substantia finita, finite substance, as res corporea, corporeal thing, what must primarily be assigned, Zuweisung, is the extensio. Indeed, we understand extended substance, or thinking substance, more easily than substance alone, disregarding that which thinks or is extended. Descartes. For substantiality is detachable ratione tantum, by reason alone. It is not detachable realiter, nor can we come across it in the way in which we come across those entities themselves which are substantially. Thus the ontological grounds for defining the world as res extensa have been made plain. They lie in the idea of substantiality, which not only remains unclarified in the meaning of its being, but gets passed off as something incapable of clarification, and gets represented indirectly by way of whatever substantial property belongs most preeminently to the particular substance. Moreover, in this way of defining a substance through some substantial entity lies the reason why the term substance is used in two ways. What is here intended is substantiality, and it gets understood in terms of a characteristic of substance, a characteristic which is itself an entity. Because something ontical is made to underlie the ontological, the expression substantia functions sometimes with a signification which is ontological, sometimes with one which is ontical, but mostly with one which is hazily ontico-ontological. Behind this slight difference of signification, however, there lies hidden a failure to master the basic problem of being. To treat this adequately, we must track down the equivocations in the right way. He who attempts this sort of thing does not just busy himself with merely verbal significations. He must venture forward into the most primordial problematic of the things themselves to get such nuances straightened out.